Hi, welcome to week 4 perception, and what we're going to do is look at basically what is perception and the strategy in which we take information in and make sense of the world around us. But we're also going to look at some of the principles of perception, and a lot of that involves gestalt. And some of this you're going to recognize and some of it you might be unfamiliar with, but you'll find it kind of interesting, I think. So that's what this week's lesson is on, when we're in week 4. And I hope you enjoy it, and don't forget to do your journal. Alrighty, good luck, and we'll see you next week.
Okay, let's look at human perception. Now what I've done here is I've put together a little structure of the process in which we typically create our own perception of the world. And so perception is reality. That is to say that each of us will perceive the stimuli that we receive, and we will interpret it oftentimes quite a bit differently, in part because of a number of different issues. Part of it is our own personal background, our personal experience. So really what we do at the first stage of developing our perception is that we do selection. That is to say, we either select some information or we delete other information. And so the first part is that we can't keep track of every bit of sensory information. If you could imagine having no filter and no stopping anything. You'd have all the visual information, all the auditory information, all the gustatory, all the olfactory, all the touch sensation. If you had all of this coming bombarding you at all times, this would be overwhelming. And so we each select that which is important for us to pay attention to. So in the morning, your alarm goes off. You select that bit of information so you can turn it off. And from there, you select another bit of information which then helps you get on your way to develop to the point where you get off to school and carry on with your day. But all through that, you select and or delete information that's not important, or select information which you need to pay attention to. And because each of us is different, we have different habits, different routines, different expectations, different things to do. Some of us have children, some of us don't. So what we select and what we delete from the environment is different from person to person, but we don't pay attention to it all. So we select certain information and we delete or ignore others. Whatever we do select, we process in our brains, and our brains help do what's called, organization. It creates cognitive structures. Now, cognitive, the substitute word you could use is thinking. So these are the structures that we use as a foundation for our thinking. And so this information is selected, is put into our brain, and our brain organizes it and puts it in places that will enable us to remember. We don't always organize very well, so that's why sometimes we don't remember so well. And we will be doing a section on memory. And so with the second stage of organization, it's just a matter of putting this stuff into usable, functional pieces. So for example, you might do your morning routine fairly much automatically without an awful lot of thinking, but it really just means that your brain has organized that routine in such a manner that you don't need to be thinking about every step along the way. And then the last piece is that about interpretation. That we select information, it's organized in particular matters to suit our needs so that we can interpret the world around us in the way that enables us to navigate the world successfully. So you are all college students, so you are all selecting the information that you feel best suits you to be the successful student you can be. Your brain is organizing. You're in the first week, so you've been going through organizing your syllabi, finding out what's due when, so you're creating these cognitive structures to be successful. And then as information is being added and you're doing your studying and doing your assignments, this gathering information and organizing it is enabling you to interpret and make sense of the things that you have to do so you can do them successfully and meet all your goals. And so perception is pretty complicated in a lot of ways, and yet in others it seems to be pretty straightforward. So let's move on. Now you've seen these before, chances are anyway. And what we're doing is principles of perception, where essentially this is our brain's rules for interpreting sensory information. Now you see what you're seeing here is what's called Figureground, and this is based on some of the gestalt psychology perspective, a German word that means or refers to the whole form, patterns, or configurations a person perceives. And so figure ground, as an example, depends upon what you call the figure, what you see as the object, and what you see as the background. So on the top right, you might see the object as a vase. Alternatively, if you were to change the white to being the background, you might see two faces pointing or facing one another. The figure ground in the middle, you might see the tree and a woman walking, past some buildings in the background and trees and the bushes in the foreground. But if you change what is the object to the face, the eyes being two features on either side of the woman who's walking, the dark feature being the face's nose, and the structure of the face being put by the tree and the shrubs. And then the other, again, you might see the woman's face using the white as the object, but if you use the black as the object, you might see a sort of a cartoonish trumpeter or saxophonist. And so the principles of perception is using gestalt, and it's using it as, in this case, using figure ground, that our brain's rules have to do with what we see as being the figure or the object and what we think as being the background. Here's a couple of other reversible figure ground patterns, and I'll leave it here. You can pause it if you want and look at it, but each one has two ways of looking at it. And so if you've tried to look at it, you might see the top left to see both optical and illusion. The top right, teach and learn. The bottom left, you and me. And the bottom right, good and evil. It has a lot to do with what you call the figure and what you call the ground. Now, Gestalt principles of grouping is another element about how the brain makes sense of the world and orders things. It's brain's rules for perceiving. We looked at the figure ground, but there's also similarity, proximity, continuity, and closure. Now, you'll find these in your textbooks, but the image is here so to give you an example. That with similarity, objects that have a similar characteristic are grouped together. So the solid dots seem to be, we tend to group them as opposed to the open dots, and whether they are horizontal or vertical lines in this case. Proximity, objects that are close together are perceived as belonging together. So instead of seeing 8 individual lines, you might see 2 groups of 4. With continuity, figures and objects are perceived as belonging together if they appear to form a continuous pattern. And so even though they don't all make exactly the same pattern, we tend to make them appear like patterns because we see them as being related. And then closure, the figures with gaps in them are perceived as complete objects. You don't need every single item to be complete for our brains to see them as a complete object or interpret them as a complete object. Okay, perceptual constancy. What we recognize about size constancy is that even though we see size change as people move away and toward us, we still know that they didn't change size. That we know in terms of perspective that the camera is close to this person's foot and the people are further away. We don't imagine that his foot or her foot is actually that big and those people are that small. We know that as people walk away from us, they don't get smaller. Just because I can close my eye as someone walks away and I can crush their heads doesn't mean they actually got smaller that I could crush their heads. When we have shape constancy, this is where objects remain the same even if their orientation to us change. That even though P, B, D, and Q are clear, you can take the P, if you will, turn it upside down and backwards and it would be a B. Take the P and turn it upside down, it would be a D. Take a P and flip it over and it becomes a Q. Well, I don't think that things change just because the orientation changed. I know that I flipped it and therefore it's a backwards or an upside down P. But I also know that when I see them in order like that things don't change. Shape constancy, that even if their orientation changes. If you stand there and hold your purse or a wallet or a book in your hand and then turn it on its edge so it's flat, it doesn't become a different object. You know it's still a book. So shape constancy. Brightness constancy is another perceptual constancy, and it appears as if the two gray dots are of different colors, but in fact they're the same color. Objects maintain the same amount of brightness even when there's a different amount of light on them. Brightness constancy is about whatever the light shifting on things doesn't change the color or the object. And color constancy, that objects maintain the same color regardless of the lighting conditions. These fruits and vegetables, or these fruits here, don't change their color if lighting changes. We know that a banana is yellow, and so even though it's in the shadows or even though it's in a very bright room and the color of that banana changes, we know that it really didn't change the color of the banana. Depth perception, the ability to perceive the visual world in 3 dimensions and to judge the distance accurately. And you need 2 eyes to be able to do this. The visual depth cues that depend on both eyes working together is the binocular depth cue. And you need 2 eyes to do that. If you were to block the light from one eye, put a patch on one eye and completely, keep the light from getting in, and then try and walk around, you would notice how difficult it would be until you could adjust. Now, if you're going to do this, please don't go near stairs and don't go out near the traffic. You will find it quite difficult at first. So if we're going to look at some of the influences that happen in terms of what influences our perception. Well, there's a number of things that influence our perception. One is our attention. This is the process of sorting through sensations and selecting some for further processing. Some sensations are automatically required minimum mental effort. So what's meant by this is you will only be able to pay attention to those things that you've selected to be paid attention to. If you're in class and you have your cell phone and the professor's talking and you're paying attention to your cell phone, there are things that the professor will say that you won't pay attention to because that's not what you're sensing. That's not what you're allowing into your brain. So attention is very important. Now, some things are more automatic and therefore don't require not a mental effort. Like I mentioned earlier, your morning routine might be somewhat more automatic and doesn't really need an awful lot of your attention. Now, inattentional blindness is focuses shift from one object to another and changes in the object are not receiving direct attention and are not noticed. Now, you may have seen this video before and you can find it on YouTube. It's where you have a group of people in white t-shirts and a group of people in black t-shirts, and the instruction is given to count the number of times that the people in the white shirts pass the ball back and forth. Now, because you've been given a particular instruction and you look very carefully to count the number of times that the white-shirted people pass the ball, after the video is done, you ask people the question, so how many times? And people give a number of answers, and you might even say, so did you notice anything else? A good number of the people who watched the video noticed nothing. And yet there was a gorilla that walked through the video. When you show the video again and mention there's a gorilla that walks through it, then everybody can see it. That is what's called inattentional blindness. Is that when you're given instructions to pay attention to something, then you start to pay attention to it. When something that you did not be instructed to pay attention to happens, you may not even notice it, even though it's right in front of you. Now, along those same lines is what's known as the cocktail party phenomenon. And so if I'm at a party and someone says my name, Even though there's a lot of other noise going around, I might notice that because it's a familiar term, one that I know about, and it's meaningful to me, so I will notice and pay attention. So when you hear your name, focus follows due to the assumption that other meaningful information was going to follow. It's not atypical that you will hear your name or hear something and then start to pay attention to it only after you've heard it. And focus. Information that receives focus is remembered while other information or stimulus received at the same time is lost. Hearing words spoken in both ears at the same time, only words that are receiving the focus of attention are recalled. Now this is an example of technology in the classroom. This was done at the University of Michigan. The upside of having technology in terms of it helps with specific pedagogy. It purposes where they can have real benefits of student learning. It gives you some students a chance to participate that will. The downside is it can be a distraction. 45% decrease in attentiveness, 38% decrease in engagement, and 34% decrease in learning. That which is what's paying attention to is what gets your focus, and what you focus on is what you remember. Some other elements about influences in perception. Well, prior knowledge can influence perception. It enhances or leads to perceptual errors. Either because of what you think you already know, you might disregard new information because you already know what that information is supposed to be. And because you've had prior knowledge, you might miss new information and an ability to update your files. Now there's two types of processing that you will also be exposed to when it comes to perception. There's top-down, bottom-up and top-down processing. The bottom-up processing is where you receive stimulus, are combined with prior knowledge to make inferences about received patterns. And so, for example, what am I seeing? Well, it's taking sensory information and assembling it and integrating it based on what you're seeing. Top-down, this is the previous experience that you've had, and conceptual knowledge are used to recognize the stimuli, the new information, and logically deduce individual components as a whole. And so you'll find this in your text. It might help you with some explanation there, but this is part of the different ways in which we process information to make sense of the world around us. And then the last piece, yes, there we go. The last piece is perceptual sets. And perceptual sets are expectations of what will be perceived. It can affect what actually is perceived. Now in this case you might see 12, 13, 14 or ABC. A perceptual set sees 12 and 14 and makes what is a B or what might be a B into a 13, but you also see the A and the C, and so that perceptual set of ABC makes the 13 look like a B to you. And so a lot of what we do in terms of our perception is to create a lot of perceptual sets. And those will either inhibit or encourage certain thinking for us, and it will affect our perception. I hope this has been helpful and useful, and take some time, go through the videos. Don't forget to pause them from time to time, and be ready just to be able to get some notes being made and some marking up of your textbook so you have it available for you for your test. Not that it's right away. Check your syllabus and you'll see when it is. All right. Thank you, everybody.